Hi, Nathan.
Hello.
Hi, Nathan. Hi, Janet. Janet, you with us? Okay. All right, Nathan, we're going to begin in just a moment. You see the source sheet?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, great. Janet, you also? You with us?
I was muted. Sorry. Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. All right, so we will get started. We're also on Facebook at this point in time, so hopefully that will stay solid most of the time. This basically is a continuation of a class that I began last week and hope to do for the next several weeks, which is to focus on the mitzvot that are connected to Eretz Yisrael, specifically agricultural and land-based things. So last week we looked at what are called the matanot aniim, the gifts to the poor that are connected to our agricultural mitzvot, like peah, leaving the corners of your fields, leket, not picking up everything, so that poor could follow you and pick up produce from your fields, and things along those lines. This week we're going to talk about kilayim, which is, I guess, translated as prohibited mixtures. The most famous case is when you take seeds from two different types of seed, two different types of plants, and you mix them together in your planting. You sow them together. That's the prohibition. But kilayim also refers to other things as well. And as you can see from the source sheet, there's actually about 6 independent mitzvot that are connected to this concept of kilayim. And so I just thought, at least to start off, we'll just...
Like mixing up a tangerine and an orange?
Well, isn't a tangerine? Right, exactly. Is that a clementina, the combination?
A tangelo.
A tangelo, okay. So it's an interesting question. A tangelo is prohibited to make, but you are permitted to benefit from it. And that will be a distinction that will become relevant in just a little bit. So I'll give you a quick overview, and then we'll get into some of the details. So you see, we're using the Sefer Chinuch as always. He gives us the mitzvah, and then as well as the source of the mitzvah. So the first time this mitzvah appears, interestingly, it's in Parsha Kedoshim, which has some of the most sort of beautiful mitzvot ben adam l'chavero. Immediately before the mitzvot we're going to now read is the mitzvah V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. So clearly, it plays a very central role in Judaism just by the proximity to such an important verse in the Torah. The first one that we are introduced is not to do with plants, but rather to do with animals. So you see the very first source, number 444, Sefer Chinuch. I'm sorry, that's a mistake. It's mitzvah number 244. It's a mistake there. So it says that you're not to mate a beast, 2 different species of a beast, right? You're not allowed to take an ox and a donkey and have them mate together. That this is a kilayim. This is a prohibited behema kilayim, a mixture of animals, and you're not permitted to do so. And we have the verse that says so in Kedoshim. Now, before I get to the meaning behind the mitzvah, which the Sefer Chinuch then offers us, let's go to the next mitzvah, number 245. That's the one we're more familiar with. To not sow seeds of a forbidden mixture, not graft to any place in the land, right? Not to take that orange tree branch and graft it onto the what did you say? I can't remember now.
Tangerine.
Tangerine, thank you. So not to do that. So not to sow 2 species of seeds, such as wheat and barley. They're clearly different, wheat and barley. However, most of the Mishnayot in the book of Kilayim try to figure out what can and cannot be actually mixed. Because if it's, let's say, a wheat and a wild wheat, they're close enough that they can be mixed. but wheat and barley is different. And then there's all different sorts of vegetables that appear very similar or of the same genus but not species, or watermelon, pumpkins share certain commonalities. Are you allowed to mix those or not? So these are questions that appear in the Mishnah, but by and large, you're not allowed to mix things that are different. It's connected to the land of Eretz Yisrael. It's connected to the land. So that's the second mitzvah. The next one appears in Dvarim, and there it says that you're not allowed to take the mixtures, let's say that wheat and barley, and plant that in a vineyard. Now, on one hand, we already knew that you're not permitted to do so. What does this mitzvah come to add? So it seems to add that there's something unique about grapes, that there's an additional prohibition that we have to be extra concerned, where they raise the stakes of the punishment when it comes to grapes. And we actually saw this last week with Peah as well, that grapevines, there's an additional gift to the poor that we give connected to grapevines. There we spoke about because there's greater simcha involved in grapes, and perhaps that's the reason there. Over here, we'll see in a little bit, it's a different prohibition. To your point, Natan, about whether or not you can have a tangelo. So here's another distinction why this mitzvah is added. You cannot, if you look at mitzvah 549, you're not allowed to eat the forbidden mixtures of the vineyard. In other words, we said that the tangelo you can eat. You can't create it, but if it's already created, you can benefit from it. When it comes to, however, the things that are connected to the grapes, not only can you not plant it, but you cannot benefit from it either. You are not allowed to eat it. So, for example, I think there's something called now a grapple. A grapple is a grape and an apple. Now, it depends how that grapple is made. Some rabbis have suggested if all the grapple is grape-infused apple, meaning you have an apple and you just infuse a little bit of grape flavor, and it couldn't grow on its own, that might be permitted. But if it's somehow combining the grape and the apple, even after it's already done, this is not something you're permitted to eat or benefit from. There's an added concern here. Mitzvah number 550 is similar to the first mitzvah we saw about animals. This one says not about mating the animals together, but you're not allowed to even work them together. Okay, so you can't have a plow, an ox, and a donkey together at the same time. And then just scrolling down, the next mitzvah, the last one, mitzvah 551, is a famous mitzvah called shatnez. Shatnez is an acronym of how cloth is made. It's woven, spun, all these different processes. So it says, shelo libosh shatnez. You're not allowed to wear shatnez. Similarly, you're not allowed to benefit from the combination. And you should not wear any clothing that is composed of wool and flax, or wool and linen. And that's what shatnez is called. As it's stated in the Torah, you shall not wear shatnez, wool and flax together. This is another kilayim. This is another mixture. So altogether, we have 6 specific mitzvot, and each of them have their own particular explanation behind them. And so what I thought I'd do tonight is to look at, very briefly, localized explanations, meaning why this specific mitzvah, what might be the reason behind this one, what might be behind the reason of this one, but really only spend a few minutes on that. What I really want to do tonight is to think of a global perspective. Is there a way of explaining all 6 of these together? Because all 6 of them share the same category of kilayim, of mixtures, or prohibited mixtures. Is there a one sort of comprehensive explanation that gives us an insight into all of them at the same time? So that's what we'll spend most of the night on, but I'll point out that there's a lot of specific reasons for each specific mitzvah. I'll just give a couple very quickly. So for example, one of my favorite explanations here in shatnez, for example. So the mitzvah of shatnez, of not mixing linen and wool together, I would suggest as part of a general value in Judaism of not mixing life and death together. We saw this, if you've learned kashrut with me, we spoke about not mixing meat and milk. One of the reasons for that is meat symbolizes death, milk symbolizes life, and we're not supposed to mix life and death. And there's a sort of a theological and moral reason behind that, because the challenges in life sometimes are so great that people will suspend their activity, assuming that death or the afterlife, we spoke about this before the other day, Natan, will repair the situation. In other words, let's say there's a terrible disease. So if you mix life and death, and really there's no difference, our life flows into the afterlife, and in the afterlife, all injustices are corrected. So you could say, oh, there's a terrible disease. It will get taken care of in Olam Haba, the afterworld. However, if we're not allowed to mix life and death, here we are right now focusing on life and making the most of it, repairing. This is our only opportunity to repair the world at this point in time. We can't rely on the opportunity of the Olam Haba. So then you'll fix that disease. You'll find a cure for that disease. So therefore, Judaism has a number of examples of separating life or symbolism, things that are symbolically represented by life, and those that are death. I would say that shatnez is another example. Wool, you share the sheep, the wool regenerates itself. It represents life. It constantly grows and comes back. Linen or flax, once you take it from the plant, that plant dies, and you'd have to plant a new plant in order to create new life. That it therefore represents death. And so you're not supposed to mix life and death. So that's one explanation. As I said, there are a number of explanations for each of these mitzvot. That's with regards to the mitzvah of shatnez. We spoke about the mitzvah of not working animals together. So Philo, I think, was probably already one of the first, but subsequent scholars have, in commentaries, make the same point. You're not allowed to work an ox and a donkey and harness them together plowing a field, because it's cruel to the animals, right? It causes pain. The donkey is much slower and weaker than the ox. So the ox is plowing ahead, and if he's harnessed to the donkey, he's pulling the donkey along. It's not comfortable for the donkey, and it's also not comfortable for the ox, who is being slowed down and pulled back. It's uncomfortable. It's a form of almost tsar balei chaim, of causing pain to animals, and so it's prohibited. I would point out that the Sefer Chinuch, who we're looking at in the introduction, almost suggests that there is a, I would say, spiritual or psychological tsar balei chaim. If you turn to the next page at the bottom, I'll turn for you. Oh, nope, I'm sorry, I skipped it already. I'm sorry, I'd already skipped, apparently had. Okay, this is the Sefer Chinuch, number 550. And he's explaining on the mitzvah of not to work two different species of animals together. You see the bold. And I say that the explanation of this commandment is the matter of causing pain to animals, tsar balei chaim, which is a prohibition of the Torah. And it is known that for the species of animals and fowl, there is great anguish in dwelling with those that are not its species, all the more so to do work with them. I remember Woody Allen had a line where he used to quote the Bible that says, you know, the messianic vision includes the lion lying down with the lamb. But he added, but that lamb won't get very much sleep, right? It's always nervous, looking over its shoulder. So similarly, you see animals in general, when they're of different species and they're sort of thrown in together, they're not exactly sure what to do. Dogs and cats are just a classic example, but many animals are uncomfortable around other animals that are not of their same species. So the Sefer Chinuch sort of expands on Philo's concern of the physical pain and says there's almost like a psychological pain that's taking place, that they are uncomfortable being so close to one another. We'll come back to this idea at the end of the Shir as well. The Rambam connects this mitzvah of not working the two animals together to the other prohibition relating to animals of not mating animals. He says the entire process of forcing animals, even those that are of the same species, to mate, it's an immodest, it's a vulgar activity, forcing animals maybe against their will to mate. He says that's not the way, Jewish farmers should act. It should be a natural process for the animals. And it's all the more so in the case of animals that are, in fact, not of the same species. You're forcing them to mate. They don't want to. That's not natural for them. And if you cause it, it's a vulgar activity that you should not be engaged in. That's his explanation of why you're not supposed to mate. He says harnessing them together is almost like a precursor. You put them in the same barn, you force them to be together all the time. That's perhaps what it leads to as well. Just going down some of the other mitzvot, we spoke about some other possible explanations. What about the kilayim of seeds, of not sowing the seeds together? So some commentaries, and as you can see, I'm drawing heavily on Philo here. He says that it's almost connected to the same values of Shemitah. Shemitah, you let the land rest. There's a physical, practical benefit of allowing the land to rest on Shemitah, that the land can regenerate and produce better crops in the future. So Kilayim may have that same impact. When you put two different seeds together, they both draw from the same nutrients inside the ground, and they draw differently. And one may draw for a longer period of time, one for a shorter period of time. You're basically making the earth work longer and harder and more different when you sort of mix these two together. And he says, so there's a practical benefit of not doing kilayim. I would say you could think of other practical benefits as well. I went picking olives a couple weeks ago, and you see that the distance between the olive trees is fairly great. It's about 5 meters. And the reason for that is so they get enough sun, they get enough room for tractors to be able to drive through. And I was talking to the owner of the farm saying, well, there's all this extra space. Have you ever thought of putting in the middle, let's say, not another tree, but maybe, some type of herbs or things that would go well with the olive tree and not really bother the olive tree. And one of the things he pointed out is that they don't do that, even if there is space, because each plant, each tree brings its own unique form of insects that try to attack it. And the trees know how to deal with their insects, but they don't know how to deal with some other tree or some other plant's insects. And so therefore, if you introduce new species close by, you're also introducing a lot of potential tsuris in your growing, that all of a sudden there's different types of insects. They feed off one another, they destroy. And again, so you have a practical benefit by not mixing the seeds. We'll talk a little bit about genetically modified organisms. Those are things like where modern science has made, a pepper seed that is resistant to chemicals, that is resistant to insects, that will grow larger, faster. All these things, it's genetically modified, and there's some very positive aspects of that, but there's also some great dangers. For example, one of them is that we don't know how they will do if they bring in, because they're a new species, if they bring in new diseases to the world that we're not accustomed to and therefore can't deal with, or if there is some type of plague that they're not accustomed to or weren't planned for, it could wipe out the entire crop. So there might be practical benefits for that. Finally, we spoke about the additional prohibition of kilayim with regards to grapes. I mentioned last week, perhaps at a positive aspect, we give more grapes to the poor, especially around the holidays, so that they can make kiddush. Here, the Sefer Chinuch actually suggests grapes represent a negative. It's interesting. The same Sefer Chinuch, one sees grapes as a positive and one here sees as a negative. And he recalls, for example, the dangers that wine does. We have the story of Noah. We have the story of Lot. They both get drunk. They both behave inappropriately. And he says, therefore, we should have an extra concern and be extra careful when we, therefore, are engaged in the world of winemaking. And so symbolically, there's an extra concern when it comes to kilayim in this regard. So those are some of the local explanations of each of these individual mitzvot. What I want to do now is to expand our scope a little and see if there is sort of a global way of answering what do all of these have in common. And to do that, I'm jumping down to, you see the Gemara in Yoma. So I think I'm going to offer 3 global explanations of what all of these mitzvot might have in common. And the first one is actually to say, there's no explanation. These mitzvot are simply chukim. Chukim are mitzvot, commandments of the king. You follow it because God commanded you. They don't have any reason. There's no explanation. You do it because that's what God said. And it's a sign of your adherence to God and your love of God that you do it even when you don't understand it. Right? All of us have that experience. Someone will ask us, a parent will ask us, not to use the towels in the guest bathroom. Or a spouse will ask not to use the towels. Why? What's the reason? Aren't towels to be used? No, they're for some, there's a reason. You don't do it even if it doesn't make sense to you, because this is what a person who you love asked you to do. Similarly, we do the mitzvahs even if we don't understand it. That's what a chok, according to some opinions, are. So you see in the Gemara in Yoma, Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught with regards to in Vayikra, where it says et mishpati ta'asu dvarim, that with regards to my ordinances, I'm reading now in the English, you shall do my ordinances and you shall keep my statutes to follow them. I am the Lord your God. That the phrase my ordinances, mishpatim, is a reference to matters that even if they had not been written, it would still be logical for them to be written. We would still keep them, like prohibitions against idol worship or inappropriate sexual relations, murder, theft, right? You know that those things are wrong. You don't need a Torah to even teach you that it's wrong. Logically, you would come up with it by yourself. And so therefore, they're included in the Torah, but you would probably follow them anyway. However, at chukotai, I'm continuing in the Hebrew, my chukim, how do they translate? My statutes. The statutes you shall keep. This is a reference to things that Satan, let's skip over that for a moment. The nations of the world, they're going to challenge you about that. They're going to say, there's no mitzvah. Why in the world are you doing something that doesn't make sense? It's not universally logical. They'll make fun of you for following these mitzvot. These are things like, don't eat pork, wearing garments that are made from diverse kinds of material. That's our mitzvah of shatnez, wool and linen. Performing the chalitza ceremony, the yavama. These are dealing with interpersonal marital relationships, that if a widow who must participate in a levirate marriage, or chalitza, the purification ceremony of the leper, the scapegoat on Yom Kippur. These are all rituals that are not logical in and of themselves, and you wouldn't necessarily follow if you weren't told to specifically do them. So the first answer is that all of these mitzvot, the reason why you follow them is because they're not logical. There is no universal explanation for them. If you see the Sforno here, he says there's something actually quite beautiful about following mitzvot that you don't understand. One of the foremost ways in which to demonstrate our fear and reverence of the Lord is not by observing commandments which we find reasonable and useful, but by observing those commandments which we can fail to understand, or worse, which are in counter to what our intelligence dictates to our mind as being useful. I know I wrote the word "to" incorrectly there. It should be 1-0. Hence, the Torah urges us, "Et chukotai tishmaru, my statutes you shall keep," that you make a special point of meticulously observing God's statutes, because God knows best. Not that you actually understand it, but because you don't understand it. And then at the bottom, you say, the examples are the efforts to produce better strains of domesticated animals. That's our mitzvah of not mixing mating animals, and better strains of agricultural products. That's Kilayim. Even if the Sforno goes on, and I've sort of updated his language, even if the scientific research says you can improve upon it, don't do it, because follow what God has told us, sort of almost jumping blindly in support of what God has to say. Okay, so that's, I think, the first explanation.
Did you mention eating pork?
I did.
What does that have to do with this?
No, so what that has to do with it is that is the argument that there's no logical reason to not eat pork. In other words, there might be. We might come up with explanations. But what the Gemara is saying is, if you were just plopped down, if you were an alien, plopped down on this planet, logically, and you're a Spock, right? And you logically would come to the conclusion that certain laws help society, right? Don't murder, don't steal. you would not logically come to the conclusion that eating pork is somehow worse than eating a cow. You just wouldn't come up with it. The Torah tells you there's a prohibition, and we could come up with explanations, but you wouldn't come up with it on your own. And these are called a chok, things that you don't understand or don't have a reason, an obvious reason in and of themselves. And the Gemara then adds, and Sforno adds, these are the mitzvot we're talking about. All of these mitzvot of Kilayim, of mixing animal species and mixing plant species and shatnez. These are chukim. They don't make sense, and that's great. You follow them civically because they don't make sense, and that shows your love of God. Now, I would point out, not everyone obviously agrees with this position of the Gemara. Let me just see for the Ramban, for example, on our verse that introduces the mitzvahs, Vayikra 19:19, says the Gemara didn't say that there are no reasons. It just said they're hidden. So if you look at the next source, the Ramban, you shall keep my statutes, but our rabbis only mention that the reason is hidden and that the evil inclination and the idolaters question about why you wear shatnez. But he goes on to say, it's not that they don't have a reason. Obviously, the fourth line, since every word of God is pure, obviously these have a logical explanation. And more than that, just because they're secret doesn't mean there aren't reasons, and we can also then pursue and find out and understand and explore those reasons. So we should, in fact, try to understand and come to them and appreciate them. So what might some of those reasons be? So as I said, altogether, I want to offer three. One I've already given you is that they're a chok, and they don't have an explanation. Now I'd like to give you two where there is an explanation. The first one is a theme by the Rambam, where he speaks about, and let's just jump down a little bit, and now talking about Maimonides. You see in his Mor Nevuchim, one of the things he suggests is that many of our practices are to reject the pagan practices that existed at the exact same time. And so in the first paragraph of the Mor Nevuchim there, he points out that there was a lot of witchcraft going on in ancient Canaan, and they thought they controlled rain, and they thought they controlled hail, and they thought they controlled everything, that they could change nature. And on the mitzvah of witchcraft, which I think is mitzvah number 62, I actually speak more about that, the problem of witchcraft. Not that it exists, but it's this idea of trying to change nature. And he says so that we engage in activities that reject this type of idol worship. And then in the second paragraph, we've explained in our large work that it's prohibited to round the corners of the head, right? The peyot, I spoke about this last week as well. And mar the corners of one beard, because that was the custom of idolatrous priests. For the same reason, the wearing of garments made of linen and wool is prohibited. The heathen priests adorned themselves with these garments containing vegetable and animal material, while they held in their hand a seal made of the mineral. And they thought if they sort of take certain items and mix the animal and the vegetable and the mineral, they then had power over nature, writes the Rambam. And so therefore, we reject wearing the linen and the wool as a way of expressing our disgust at the practice of the Canaanites and rejecting their theology. So that's the Rambam's answer. And if you look right below, you see the Sefer Chinuch number 62, which is where he writes about witchcraft. And I would point out that when he gives an explanation earlier, up above, what is the reasoning for these particular mitzvot? He gives two. One of them we'll see in a moment. The second answer he gives is, look at what I wrote at mitzvah number 62, where it's all about witchcraft. That these people used to engage in witchcraft by doing certain things, and we're trying to reject that idea. And so you see that, he says, from the roots of the commandment it is known that magic is a very bad thing, causes many mishaps to people. I don't have to write at length about it. These things are well known. We are commanded to put away from the world someone who makes efforts with this as coming against the will of God, that God wants the world to be settled, and everything should be administered in a natural way, as nature was at the beginning of creation. And this one comes along and wants to change that. and therefore that's what magic is about. We should try to get rid of it. And it's not good for the creatures of the world that God created. He commanded each one according to its species. That's from Bereshit, to do exactly as it was commanded to do. So that's the second explanation, is that based on the Rambam and the Sefer Chinuch, it has to do with trying to reject pagan practices. I would go one step further, and maybe not just pagan practices, but also even pagan law. You see, I brought a source from the Hittite laws, which are parallel to our biblical laws. They're probably a little bit earlier than our biblical laws. There is a similar prohibition to Kilayim. There are some important differences, but it's similar enough that it's worthwhile to explore. If anyone sows seeds on top of a seed, right, it doesn't say that they're mixed together, but one seed on top of the other, it's not clear when they found the cuneiform in which this was written. Some people have read it to mean it's two different people. One person sows one seed, and another person comes and sows his seed on top of it. So it's almost like a stealing, right? I'm trying to grow my seed instead of you. It's almost like I'm stealing your land. By the way, our Mishnah Kilayim has a similar idea as well, that if you plant something and it crosses into someone else's property and creates Kilayim, it's almost as if you're trying to steal their land as well. But the simple reading of this Hittite law is that it's a form of Kilayim, that there's one seed on top of another seed, that it's a ritual prohibition, not an ethical one. They shall place his neck, the person who brought the second seed and planted on top of the first. They shall place his neck on a plow. They shall hitch up teams of oxen, and they shall turn the face of one team in one direction and the team of the other in the other direction, and they pull. In other words, they put this person to death for mixing seeds, for planting one seed on top of the other seed. Now, in the Hittite law, this actually becomes less severe in time. It actually eventually becomes where you kill, instead of the human being and the oxes, you kill sheep, but you have to do some type of a ritualistic process to redeem the land. That the land itself is considered unholy because it held these type of mixtures. So if this was a predominant law at the time, you would see Kilayim potentially as a rejection of the severity, meaning it's a very important mitzvah, but you don't kill someone over it. And so you see a little greater sensitivity. We've seen this elsewhere before, that it's different than their understanding of an eye for an eye. It's different than some of the other extreme punishments that existed in the ancient world. And when you're familiar with those other laws, you begin to look at the Torah and realize the radicalness in that it's a little bit more proportional to what is taking place. So again, maybe these mitzvot are rejecting the surrounding prevalent cultures with which Jews lived at that point in time. I want to end with one last global answer, so to speak. And let's go to the very beginning, the Sefer Chinuch, the first time where he offers an explanation. So in mitzvah number 244, do you see the bold print now? Right. It is from the roots of the commandment that God, blessed be he, created his world with wisdom, with understanding and with knowledge. And so he made and formed all the forms according to that which was fitting for its matter to be designed according to the design of the world, and he blessed them. And God saw everything that God had done, and behold, it was good. And he blessed it because this is how God wanted the world to be. In other words, God created everything unique. Everything was designed. God saw how the world would develop and even evolve. And that evolution was implanted at the very beginning. But what was not planted is man changing nature. Now, it's true that human beings are called upon to subdue the world. We're called on to create just like God and continue God's creation and be partners in God's creation. But being a partner means you respect the senior partner. And therefore, we're not meant to change or to destroy that which God created. And sometimes when you do, in fact, create these new creatures, whether they're in the animal world or the plant world, not only does it show a sort of a lack of satisfaction in God's created world, right? Couldn't we live without the tangelo? Couldn't we just simply recognize God's beautiful creation of the tangerine and the orange? There's maybe a lack of satisfaction. But more than that, sometimes it's also destroying God's actual world. So, for example, let's go back to the Ramban on our verse. Remember, I brought the Ramban the first time to show that he says it's okay to look for the explanation of mitzvot. The continuation of that same Ramban, which again is the Ramban on our verse in Vayikra, 19:19. He says as follows. He actually says there's two answers here that he wants to focus on. The reason for the forbidden mixtures is that God created species in the world. In all of the world with spirits and plants and animate things, and he gave them the ability to reproduce such that the species survive with them forever. I mean, God created certain species and he wants them to exist. He wants them to continue and he wants them to thrive. So he commanded that they be able to produce according to their species and that they never ever change. As it is stated about them, according to its species, they continue. And this is the reason that we breed animals one with the other, to the continuation of the species, just as men have conjugal relations with women in order to also be fruitful and multiply. Like there's continuity, there's celebration in that. And one who crosses two species together changes and denies God's act of creation. Not good enough. It's similar to the Sefer in that regard. As if he was thinking the Holy One, blessed be he, did not perfect the world completely.
Is that like mixing a donkey and a horse to make a mule?
Yes, yes. And the Ramban is going to actually talk about that. He says there's two dangers in what you're doing there. One is that it's a theological statement of dissatisfaction or disapproval of God's created world, that somehow you know better. But secondly, he says that there is a practical negative effect that is perhaps even worse. When you mix those things together, you destroy the future. You destroy the ability of those things to continue. If you continue, the moreover, species of animals will not give birth when one species is crossed with another. They don't actually produce offspring. And even those that are close enough in nature as to actually give birth to an offspring, such as mules, like this is your point, that are born from crossing horses and mules, horses and donkeys, their seed will be excised. They will not be able to give to the next generation. They will not be able to reproduce. And so you're being short-sighted. For a gain now, to create a certain animal now, you're frustrating God's creation, and you're destroying the possibility of continuing along. Right? This happens all the time. It's instant gratification rather than thinking about the long natural process that things get developed. He says that same thing happens with plants as well. When you mix two species, they often also do not grow afterwards. And if they do, sometimes they grow oddly. The truth is, we've seen this in the modern world with the concentration of seeds in just a few international massive agro companies. Monteso, I forget how to pronounce that. Monsanto. Thank you. So what used to happen, of course, is farmers would grow their crops. And then at the end of that, they would take out some seeds, they wash them, they prepare them, and then they use seeds for the next year. Monsanto comes along and says, we can create seeds for you that will be more resistant to chemicals that you need to use to keep the bugs away. By the way, it's of course their chemicals, but we can produce that for you. We can produce that the yield will be much larger, and we can produce that the fruits will be better and stronger, all these different things. So farmers buy into it. And indeed, the first year, the harvest is 15, 30% larger than the previous year. But the they can't take those seeds. First of all, the Monsanto says it's illegal to plant the seeds again. But more than that, even if they planted them, very seldom do they produce anything a second year, or they produce deformed vegetables the second year. So the farmer now has to buy the seed from Monsanto the next year, rather than a very natural process of continuing. The seeds most of us eat today they're like designer seeds, right? They have the GMO, they're designer seeds, and they can't continue any further. And that produces a number of different results on an economic, social level. If you do a Google search, you'll see that in India, there's a high rate of suicide amongst farmers of cotton because Monsanto controls their cotton seeds. And these farmers basically become modern day serfs because they become in debt. They can't use their own seeds. They have to buy seeds from Monsanto. And they end up using the seeds and they need to use the same chemicals, and they get bound, and they basically work in order to pay off the debt of purchasing the seed. They can't continue on. It's not a natural. And many of them are committing suicide as a result of this, that they can't control their own destiny. There's, of course, environmental dangers to this as well. We don't know necessarily what will be unleashed by using these type of seeds as opposed to natural seeds. One of the concerns is that since each seed requires a great deal of research, that the diversity of the plant world is limited. Because if you're a big agricultural company, you're not going to have thousands and thousands of different plants that you focus on. You're going to minimize it and streamline your production as much as possible. And so you'll have far fewer plants available, and they're going to be the same in every part of the world. You're not going to be different for different parts of the world. You want that uniformity. And what eventually happens is you destroy the diversity in the plant world. And if, God forbid, there's ever an insect or a plague that comes along that the genetically modified seeds can't deal with, you can wipe out the entire crop. There's a book called Empires of Food, which traces the history of great empires that primarily made their wealth from food, the ability to store food, the ability to grow more than they needed to eat, and not let it rot, and the ability to trade that food. And you see throughout history, these empires of food grow and become incredibly powerful, and then they're often destroyed because human beings always think that there's going to be sunny days with just a little bit of rain. There's not going to be a plague, right? Things happen that you can't always predict. This year has taught us that more than anything else. And so these empires have been destroyed from time to time. And so there's the danger, of course, through disease, through infestation, that these seeds could become a disaster. There's actually a place near the North Pole that is protecting all natural seeds so that we have some historical record of what seeds actually were. But each year, natural seeds are being destroyed because of this pressure to constantly modify them and change God's nature, and it eventually often also destroys. Now, I should say parenthetically, I don't want to take away the good that these do as well. Right? God says in Ashrei, we say in Ashrei, that God is able to feed the entire world. Modern technology has allowed us to create food at a much higher level in order to feed the entire world. And so we should give praise for that. And indeed, the halacha is that when it comes to pikuach nefesh, you are allowed to change some of the halachot I've spoken about in order to do so. Already at the time of the Rambam, he writes in his Mishnah Torah, for example, that Kilayim doesn't apply, for example, to plants that when you mix them, they're not really for food, but they're really for medicine. That if you could somehow create positive medicinal effect by creating a Kilayim, so then that would be permitted to do so. So there is permission within the world, but we have to always be aware that there are dangers that exist as well. And so that's one of the things that if we sort of pick upon what the Ramban is saying, he says the animals become sterile, and not only do the animals sometimes become sterile, but also the plants become sterile. You have to be careful of that because we are then ultimately potentially destroying not only not appreciating God's world, we're also potentially destroying God's world. The Ibn Ezra, I think, says, if Ibn Ezra, he interprets it, he kind of picks up on what the Ramban says and gives us a command to preserve, like not only not to destroy, but to actively try to preserve. And he reads this in the pasuk that we've already read about et chukotai tishmeru. If you remember, we said, keep my chukim, right? You should keep my things that even if you don't understand, you understand it's slightly different. The reason for mentioning do not interbreed different kinds of animals after the previous commandments, right, is just to say that just as there is a requirement to be holy, remember this took place all in Kedoshim, so there's all these mitzvot of holiness. Just as there is a requirement to be holy implies that you must not do violence to other human beings. Remember I mentioned that this comes right after the mitzvah, Yehavta l'recha kamocha. So one explanation why that may be is right here by the Ibn Ezra. Just as you have an obligation to not do violence to other human beings, so it also implies that you must not do anything to animals which alters the work of God. This is why Scripture says, preserve my decrees. You must preserve each species and not interbreed one species with another. In other words, the way we read it previously is preserve my decrees means you have to keep a chok even if you don't understand it. That's what you have to really guard and watch and make sure you keep it meticulously. Ibn Ezra says, no. The commandment of preserve is what you actually have to keep. Preserving God's species. That's what makes them a chok, is that you have to preserve these different species so that they exist for all time. That if a tangelo were so delicious and so much better than an orange or a tangerine, eventually those things might fall to disuse. And if they then fall to disuse, so then you've frustrated God's creation. God wanted the orange to exist. Not to intermingle, and continuing in the Ibn Ezra, even a field or a garment serves as a reminder. Right? There's symbolism in this. Whether or not you eat it or you don't eat it, that's not the point. So long as you remember the mitzvah, right? Every time you eat an orange and you pass over the tangelo, you're making a theological statement. There are many commandments that are primarily reminders, like the festivals, wearing tzitzit, right? We look at tzitzit. By looking at the tzitzit, we remember other mitzvot. Hearing the shofar, affixing mezuzah, wearing tefillin. He says these are the same type of mitzvot as well. You look at what you're wearing, the shatnez, or your fields separated. And now I will reveal to you a little known principle. Whoever is complete in his intellectual understanding is necessarily also complete in his religious observance. Constantly keep these ideas, these values around, and you'll be able to fulfill your religious obligations as well. So it's about honoring creation, protecting God's creation, showing satisfaction in creation, and not destroying. That's I think the general premise of the mitzvot. I want to just end by adding to this point just a little bit. And to add to it, I want to ask three questions. One of them we've already asked. Why does these mitzvot follow right after V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha? And the Ibn Ezra gives us one answer, but I'd like to look at another answer as well. The second question is one halacha I didn't mention, but it is an important halacha that with regards to shatnez, for example, mixing linen and wool, you're not allowed to mix linen and wool in your regular garments. But if you were the Kohen, right, a Kohen Gadol, you did mix linen and wool. Those garments had the shatnez; they were mixed, and in theory, you could have your tzitzit mixed with linen and wool as well. In theory, when you're engaged in certain holy activities, shatnez doesn't apply. Why should that be? The opposite. If this is an important mitzvah, the closer you get to God, the holier you are, the more you should be observing the mitzvah. And then the third question is sort of a technical question on a machloket between Rashi and the Rabbeinu Tam. Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, with regards to shatnez, are disagreeing over what actually constitutes shatnez. So Rashi says, you have the linen and you have the wool, and you put them together, and you spin them together, you comb them together, you do everything together such that they become a brand new fabric together, and then you weave them together, and that's shatnez. When they've done everything together, it's almost as if you've gotten rid of their independence, they're totally integrated with one another. Rabbeinu Tam says, no. What is shatnez? It's when you have, wool, and you have the linen, and they're independent, and then you weave them together. So you could see each of them independently. That's shotness. Rashi disagrees. What's the basis of their disagreement? Why do they hold like they hold? So hold those three questions there for a moment. Let's look at one more source, and then we'll come up with one more global answer why all of these mitzvot of Kilayim are valuable. So you see the last source I brought is from the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. It says, Rabbi Joshua ben Korcha says, the Holy One, blessed be he, he said, heaven forbid, never let the offerings of Cain and Abel be mixed up with one another. Goes back all the way to the near beginning of the world. Cain v'Hevel, they each brought a sacrifice to God. Cain brought, right, if you see furthering on, thou shalt not wear, okay, it doesn't say here what they brought, but if you remember the story, right, Cain brings, it says, some type of vegetable. The Midrash says the vegetable that was brought was linen, was flax. And it says Hevel brings from the sheep. Cain's offering to God is rejected. Abel's offering to God is accepted. Now, we know that they have this huge fight, Cain and Abel, and Cain kills Abel. The Midrash says, what were they fighting over? There's a famous Midrash that says they're fighting either over land or religion, over women. And it's an interesting Midrash to look at some other time. But the text, the simple explanation seems to be as follows, that Cain brings his offering, it's rejected. Abel brings his offering, it's accepted. Cain gets jealous, gets upset, and then he goes and kills Abel. And we are told now in this Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, the teaching of Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha, that says, you never want to mix Cain and Abel. Even in the garment you're wearing, you want to make sure to keep the two of them separate. Whatever caused them to fight and Cain to kill Abel, you want to try to destroy that idea now and get rid of it completely. And so the question is, what exactly is their sin? What exactly was the fight all about? So again, if we go over the text, you'll see, as I said, Cain brings his offering and God rejects it, and Cain doesn't say anything. Cain is not upset. He's not angry. He doesn't get upset with his brother. We don't know what he's feeling. Maybe he's going to try again. Maybe he'll bring something else. Maybe he figured out, you know what? So God doesn't like flax. Maybe it symbolizes, there's a lot of Kabbalistic arguments that say that the flax symbolizes Egyptian mentality. The Nile River is called, according to Rashi, the Pishon, as one of the 4 primordial rivers, and Pishon is very close to Pishtan, flax. And Rashi says that's because the Nile, all along the Nile, there was flax, linen everywhere there. And it was symbolic of sort of this arrogant religious perspective that we don't need God because we have the water, right? Very different than Eretz Yisrael, where we have to pray to God in order to have water, in order for our crops to survive. They felt that the Nile provided, they didn't need it at all. So maybe there was something wrong in bringing the flax. And maybe he would have tried something else, a different produce. But what happens then after that is Abel brings his product from the sheep. We always assume it's an actual sheep that he brings, that it was an animal sacrifice. But maybe he was bringing the wool. But whatever he brings, it's accepted. And at that point in time, Cain gets upset. He wasn't upset before. What makes him upset is jealousy of his brother. He judges his worth based upon how his brother is valued by God. He wasn't upset at first when it's just rejected. Maybe there's a reason he thinks. But now Abel is being accepted by God. That gets me upset. That makes me furious. Now I'm going to go out and kill him. And I think that's the sort of the primal sin, maybe even the first sin, the first great sin after eating of the tree, is that Cain judges himself and values himself based upon an in juxtaposition to the people around him. And he only sees his value in terms of how does he compare to other people. When you begin to compare yourself to other people, judge yourself based upon other people, that becomes a problem. And I think it fits very nicely with the idea that we were developing with the Ramban and others, because basically what Kilayim is all about is protecting the individuality or the uniqueness of God's creations. God says, I've created X and I've created Y. You want to come along and create something new, and in a sense, surpass and bypass and supersede X and Y. And you want to create something better. The Sefer Chinuch says, even if it's better, you shouldn't do it, because you should respect that which is already created, but you should also respect the individuality and uniqueness of other things that have been created. Sefer Chinuch also says, by the way, I bolded it in one of the sources, that this is how we should relate not just to plants and animals, but also human beings. Then all the more so, again, a koshakan. If you're supposed to treat every animal as unique and not try to suggest that they're obsolete and I need something better, so all the more so, that's how we're supposed to look at human beings as well, and respect the uniqueness of every single human being. That's why it comes right after the V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, because loving your neighbor as yourself means that you have to respect your neighbor in the same way you respect yourself, the same way that you appreciate your differences, you value who you are differently. You have to feel the same way about him and his differences. It's also, I think, the explanation of the machloket with the Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi. Rashi says, if you create a totally new fabric and you can't even see the wool and the linen anymore because they're totally integrated now, that's kilayim. That's the real problem, is that you've destroyed. When you have them still independent and still separate and they're just woven together, that's not kilayim. I don't find that as problematic, because that may make the garment even stronger. The Philo points out that sometimes people made kilayim in garments because they thought they were making the garment stronger. But the truth of the matter is, because they were two different things, the garment often tore. It was for our own benefit. I want to say, not physically, but spiritually, there's something going on there as well. You think that by creating something new, by merging people and making them give up their uniqueness, you're creating something new and better, and it's going to be stronger? Let's say perhaps not. Perhaps not by allowing people to maintain their independence and their uniqueness, you've made it actually weaker. There's a book, just because I'm already at 9 o'clock, I don't want to continue too long, but it's called Conformity. It's actually a lecture by Cass Sunstein. And the basic point he makes is that sometimes when you insist on conformity and destroying the uniqueness of individuals, not just is the individual suffer, but the entire society. That by having one person dissent, for example, you're more likely to get to the truth. That when everyone has to think the exact same way, he gives the example, for example, of a jury, that independently they asked individual jurists how they felt a person should be punished, for example. And they each said, something fairly moderate. But when they all got together, they all drifted to a much more extreme position. There was no one there to say, stop, wait a second. And so by protecting uniqueness, not only do you get more correct answers, but you also avoid extremism along those lines as well. And the final point that I would end with is why the Kohen and why holy garments are exempt from kilayim, from shatnez. Because I said the problem of Cain and Abel is that you judge yourself in comparison to other people. The Kohen Gadol, when he was standing before God, judged himself only in comparison to himself and to what God wants of him. When you judge yourself according to what God wants of you, so then there's no problem of all these other mixtures and improvements and other things that we might want to do. But when you judge yourself only according to other people, not what God wants, so then the mixture becomes problematic for all the reasons that we discussed tonight. I hope you enjoyed. We'll talk again next week. Any questions?
No, thank you.
Okay. All right. Have a great night. Nice to hear from you. All right. Take care.